all these conversations I'm having with myself, I guess, about metaphor, the predominant use of metaphor that I'm using is that which is found in cognitive linguistics, conceptual metaphor theory. And in a sense I've been, in many ways, remiss in ignoring poetic metaphor and the exclusive use of the term metaphor to, pretty much exclusively, to that kind of usage, to its usage as a trope, as a linguistic turn, if you like, within non-literal writing. And in a sense, I think what I've been assuming up to this point, not assuming, but what I haven't overtly considered, is the idea that what the role is of poetic metaphor. Certainly, conceptual metaphor theory and embodied cognition stress the importance of metaphor in day-to-day life, in routine cognition. That most of what we say, certainly more the interesting stuff that we talk about, is only possible to say, and indeed only possible to think, because we make use of metaphors, even without thinking. It's an unconscious process. But we think and talk about abstractions and metaphors unproblematically. When we think about it, we don't have any issues. We don't seem to have any difficulty understanding ourselves when we think like that. And crucially, we also relatively unproblematic understanding when they use conceptual metaphors. So when someone says to me, "Do you see what I mean?" I don't have to go through some sort of complex translation process in which I think, all right, that's a poetic illusion in which seeing is associated with knowing. I just unproblematically get it. Nor is that, from what I understand, simply a result of particular sort of cultural understanding. Most cultures have that very same metaphor, for example, that associates knowing and seeing. Okay, so because of this ubiquitous, largely covert or non-conscious use of metaphor in our thinking, our talking, our hearing, understanding, it suggests that poetic metaphor, or it suggests that, yes, that there's perhaps less need to look at poetry and poetics because of that, because of the dominance. Poetry is a relatively small subsection of a much greater discourse occupying the poetic realm and the metaphorical, metonymic realm. However, having said that, it probably is worth visiting that again. But just to remind myself one last time, the metaphor is not poetics, or at least metaphor is not restricted to poetry. So when we're talking about metaphor, we're not just talking about poetry, we're talking about routine thought. However, the reverse is probably not the case. When we're talking about routine thought, in some way we are talking about poetry. In a sense, the tropes, the linguistic terms, and in many ways possibly all of the knowledge that's been gained in relation to poetics over the centuries, possibly also apply to some extent to thought. And I think that is evidenced in some ways. There's a really nice book by Raymond Gibbs called The Poetics of Mind, in which he relates tropes which we associate with poetics, irony, synecdoche, metonymy, metaphor itself. He analyses those partly in terms of poetics and the arts more generally, music, but also refer quite clearly to how those mechanisms, if you like, also function as part of how we would think poetically, of necessity. And that's thinking about in the most apparently empirical, apparently positivistic, apparently rational, apparently literal way. Even as far as something like mathematics is concerned, for example, which one might assume is the most literal of forms, or the least poetic. Work by Lakoff and Nunez, and I've made a really robust case that even mathematics is based on those poetics. So I think this idea of the poetic informing cognition, both conscious and non-conscious, consciously in the form of poetry, but also non-consciously in the form of routine speech and routine cognition, is quite important. I think you also find this really nicely put in Bachelard's Poetics of Space, which I've just been rereading. He talks about a poetics of the imagination. I think it's particularly interesting because he wrote that maybe 50 years ago, and it's coming from a kind of phenomenological tradition. And it precedes a lot of the work that's been done in the last 15, 20 years on the relationships between embodiment and cognition, and the role that metaphor, imagination, and poetics actually play in all forms of thought. So I think this term poetics, and more broadly a poetics of the imagination, is quite useful. And when I'm talking about metaphor, I'm not rejecting metaphor and those sort of tropes within poetry. Following Gibbs and Lakoff and others in acknowledging the role that poetics plays in other forms of cognition, other forms of thought, and other forms of expression.